The evening the magistrate's clerk announced her name in the assembly room at Harrogate, the candles seemed to dim of their own accord. Or perhaps it was only that every head turned at once and absorbed the light. Miss Cecily Markham stood at the entrance to the room in a gown of pale gray wool, her only good gown, pressed the night before by her own hands into something approximating decency. She had not meant to arrive at the moment of the announcement. She had not meant to arrive at all. The note from her cousin Agnes had said only that there was someone she must see, someone who could help, and Cecily had come because she had learned over the past 6 months that refusing invitations led only to greater isolation, and isolation was a luxury she could not afford. The clerk did not read her name in any official capacity. What he said to a woman in yellow silk near the door was simply, "That is Miss Markham, the one from Felthorpe." And the woman in yellow silk did not bother to lower her voice when she repeated it to the woman beside her. "The companion who stole Lady Ravenswood's emerald brooch." Cecily did not move. The room had decided who she was before she crossed the threshold. 6 months had not softened that verdict. 6 months had not changed the fact that she had been dismissed without a character, that Lady Ravenswood's steward had presented her name to the magistrate in Felthorpe, that the inquiry had found insufficient evidence to prosecute, and that this finding, rather than restoring her reputation, had served only to confirm in the minds of society that she was the sort of woman about whom inquiries were made. She walked forward into the room because she had the letter. She always had the letter. The letter was folded in the small beaded reticule at her wrist, the paper worn thin at its creases from how often she had opened and refolded it over the past months. It was a letter from Mr. Tobias Fenn, the silversmith in Harrogate, who had examined the emerald brooch for Lady Ravenswood the previous November. His letter, obtained at no small cost in dignity and perseverance, stated plainly that the brooch presented to him for assessment bore a hairline crack across the central stone that had been present on his first examination of the piece, 17 years prior, and that no brooch with a cracked stone could have been sold as a genuine article without that defect being disclosed. It also stated, with the careful precision of a man who had handled fine objects for 30 years, that a companion of modest means could not plausibly have substituted a false stone for the original, without access to tools and materials she demonstrably did not possess. The letter did not exonerate her in any court of law. It exonerated her, in fact. These were not the same thing. She had found Agnes near the windows, a slight woman in blue muslin who turned when she heard Cecily's step and pressed her hand with both of hers. "He is here," Agnes said. "The Earl of Cranmore. He arrived this afternoon. His solicitor is with him, and they have been asking about the Ravenswood matter." Cecily was quiet for a moment. Why would the Earl of Cranmore ask about the Ravenswood matter? Agnes bit her lip. "Because Lord Ravenswood was his cousin," she said. "And because Lord Ravenswood died 3 weeks ago, and the estate now passes through the family, and there are questions of the household accounts." The room pressed on all sides. Cecily kept her breathing even, the way she had learned to do when the pressure of being publicly observed threatened to show in her face. She thought about the letter in her reticule. She thought about what it meant that someone connected to Ravenswood had come asking questions. She had not yet seen the Earl of Cranmore. She saw him a moment later. He stood near the card tables, and he was not looking at them. He was looking across the room at her, with the specific quality of attention that a man of absolute composure reserves for something that has surprised him. He was perhaps 35, tall, with the kind of stillness in his frame that suggested he had long since stopped making unnecessary movements. His hair was dark, cut close. His face was the kind of face that settled into severity when no expression was required of it, and no expression was required of it now. He wore a dark coat, white cravat, the plain good tailoring of a man who considered his clothes adequate rather than ornamental. He did not look away when she caught his gaze. She looked away first. If you have ever watched a woman hold herself together under the weight of a crowd's collective judgment, you know how much it costs. Cecily turned back to Agnes, and her hands were perfectly still. The first time someone spoke the words in her hearing that evening. It was a Mrs. Prescott, a stout woman with an excellent pearl necklace, who paused near Cecily and Agnes with the particular brightness of a person who is about to perform charity. "Miss Markham," she said, "I did not expect to see you here. I suppose one must make one's way somehow, after." She smiled, and the smile was perfectly civil, and she moved on. Agnes pressed Cecily's arm. Cecily said nothing. The Earl of Cranmore was making his way around the room. She tracked him without appearing to, the way she had learned to track all sources of potential difficulty, in the same manner she had once watched doorways in Lady Ravenswood's house when the housekeeper was in a cold temper. He spoke to several gentlemen near the fire. He accepted a glass from a footman and did not drink from it. He had the quality, she observed, of a man who came to rooms in order to assess them rather than to enjoy them. His solicitor, a small, neat man introduced to her shortly afterward as Mr. Sayers, presented himself with a bow and asked if she might spare a quarter of an hour. The Earl of Cranmore stood slightly behind him, and he said nothing. And his silence was the kind that made everything around it quieter. She said yes. She would always say yes to a quarter of an hour that might change something. Mr. Sayers led them to a small anteroom off the assembly hall, a room with 2 chairs and a writing table and a branch of candles that gave the space the intimacy of a drawing room rather than the formality of an office. The Earl of Cranmore closed the door. He took the chair nearest the window without being invited, and Mr. Sayers remained standing, and Cecily sat with her reticule in her lap and her back straight, the way her mother had taught her. "You are Miss Cecily Markham," Mr. Sayers said, "formerly companion to the late Lord Ravenswood's household." "To Lady Ravenswood," she said. "Lord Ravenswood I saw perhaps 4 times in as many years." The Earl said nothing. His gaze moved from the solicitor to her. "You were dismissed in October," Mr. Sayers continued, "on the occasion of the disappearance of an emerald brooch from Lady Ravenswood's jewelry case. I was accused of taking it," she said. "The magistrate in Felthorpe found insufficient evidence to prosecute. I have here a letter from Mr. Tobias Fenn, silversmith, which addresses the matter further." She opened the reticule and produced the letter without ceremony, setting it on the table between them. She did not explain it. She let Mr. Fenn's 30 years of expertise speak in his own words. Mr. Sayers read. He passed it to the Earl without comment. The Earl read it without visible reaction, his face still as slate water on a windless morning. He refolded it and set it back on the table and looked at her. "Where were you when the brooch was taken?" he said. She had answered this question many times. "In the nursery, with Lady Ravenswood's granddaughter, from 2:30 in the afternoon until the supper bell. The nursemaid, Mrs. Pollard, was present for the full duration. The footman, Thomas Brent, passed the nursery door with the afternoon tea at 4 o'clock and saw me there." Were Mrs. Pollard and Brent questioned by the magistrate? "They were not," she said, "because the magistrate's clerk assumed they would confirm the household's account, and he did not send for them." A silence. The Earl set the letter on the table with the precision of a man returning a thing to its exact place. He said, "The household's account being Lady Ravenswood's account." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer than was necessary. She did not look away this time. "Miss Markham?" he said, and his voice was level, unhurried, as if the words required no particular weight to land as they did. "I have spent the past 3 weeks reviewing the Ravenswood accounts since my cousin's death. There are irregularities in those accounts that bear on your situation directly. I have reason to believe the brooch was sold." She heard him. She understood what he was saying. She did not let herself feel it yet. "Sold by whom?" she said. "That is what I intend to establish." He rose, smoothed his coat once with a practiced hand, and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. "You will be available tomorrow morning." It was not a question. She had already learned that his questions did not sound like questions. "Yes," she said. He left. She sat for a moment longer with the letter in her hands, her pulse quiet in her throat, and she thought about the nursery at Ravenswood House on the afternoon of the 15th of October, and about Mrs. Pollard's face when the accusation was first made, and about how Mrs. Pollard had not looked at her when the steward came. The following morning came clear and cold, the last of October pressing down on Harrogate like a held breath. Cecily arrived at the address Mr. Sayers had sent to her by note at the inn where she lodged, a respectable guest house near the mineral baths, close enough to the better establishments to be credible, far enough to confirm what her situation had become. The address was a set of rooms in a quiet street, the kind of lodging a careful man of means takes when he intends to conduct business without display. Mr. Sayers admitted her. The Earl of Cranmore was already at a writing table, his coat replaced by a plainer one, letters open before him. He looked up when she entered and gestured toward a chair across the table without rising, and she took it. "I have written to the magistrate in Felthorpe," he said. "I have written to Mrs. Pollard, who has since left Ravenswood's employ, and I have received, this morning, a letter from a dealer in Bath who purchased an emerald brooch from a woman matching Lady Ravenswood's description in November of last year." He slid the letter across the table to her. She read it. The emerald brooch was described precisely. The date was the 22nd of November, 5 weeks after Cecily's dismissal. The woman who sold it had given her name as Mrs. Gerald. She set the letter down. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not. "Mrs. Gerald is Lady Ravenswood's sister," she said. "She was visiting Ravenswood House in the week before I was dismissed." "I know," he said. A small silence opened between them, the kind that happens when two people have arrived at the same understanding by different paths, and neither is quite ready to speak it aloud. The fire in the grate shifted. A coal dropped. The Earl watched her face, and something in his expression changed, not softening exactly, but becoming less deliberately composed. There was a quality to his attention, she thought, that was different from the quality of the room's attention last evening. The room had looked at her to confirm what it already believed. He was looking at her to see what was actually there. "You knew you could not prove it," he said. "Not without the dealer's letter, and not without someone willing to question the household's version. You knew it when they dismissed you." "Yes," she said. "And you kept the silversmith's letter." "I gathered every piece I could," she said. "I had hoped a solicitor might be found who would take the matter seriously. They would not, without a patron who had standing to make the inquiry worthwhile." He looked at her for a long moment. "How long have you been in Harrogate?" 6 weeks. I came because Agnes wrote that there might be work. There was not." "What are you living on?" The question was direct in the way that all his questions were direct, without softening, without the social lubricant of apology that most people applied to impertinence to make it easier to receive. She found, to her surprise, that she preferred it. "I have a small sum remaining from my savings as a companion," she said. £3 and some shillings. I give lessons in French and music to the daughters of a merchant family 2 mornings a week." He did not comment on this. He looked back at the dealer's letter on the table, and something in his jaw settled. a slight tightening she had already learned to read as the outward limit of whatever he felt. "I intend to bring this matter before a formal inquiry," he said. "As the current senior representative of the Ravenswood family, I have standing to do so. You will be needed as a witness." "I am aware of what that will mean," she said. "For my reputation." "It will mean the restoration of it," he said. She shook her head, very slightly. "It will mean my name is spoken aloud again in every assembly room in England, attached to the word emerald, and the word theft, and the word inquiry, regardless of the outcome. I know how these things work, my lord." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Miss Marcham, have you spent the past 6 months gathering evidence, or have you spent the past 6 months waiting for someone else to clear your name?" She held his gaze. "Both," she said. Something shifted in him. A fractional change, almost invisible, the kind the body makes before the mind catches up. He looked at her letter from the silversmith, still on the table between them, worn thin at the creases. "I will find you a solicitor who will not require a patron," he said. "The inquiry will proceed under my family's standing. Your name will be stated plainly as a wronged party, not as a defendant." She had not expected this. She had expected to be of use to his investigation, in the way that witnesses were of use, instrumentally, and then set aside. She had not expected him to look at those worn creases of the paper and understand what they meant about the past 6 months. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would not answer. Then he said, "Because I have read the inquiry record, and I have read your silversmith's letter, and I have spoken with your cousin Agnes, who told me where to find you, and because a thing done badly in my family's name is my responsibility to undo." He rose and moved to the window, putting his back to her, and he stood there looking at the street below. She studied the line of his shoulders, the set of his neck, the slight tension in his hands where they rested at his sides. There was a miniature on the writing table, she noticed, a small oval portrait in a worn leather case, turned face down. She did not ask about it. She filed it in the place where she kept things she did not yet understand. The weeks that followed moved in the particular register of a life held in suspension, waiting for the machinery of justice to turn. Mr. Sayers submitted the petition to the magistracy in Felthorpe. The dealer in Bath was contacted and agreed, with some relief, to provide a formal statement, the brooch having been, as he explained to Mr. Sayers, a source of unease to him since the moment of purchase. Mrs. Pollard, reached by letter at her current position in York, did not reply for 10 days. When she replied, she confirmed what Cecily had already known, that she had been present in the nursery the entire afternoon of the 15th of October, and that she had been told by the steward that her memory was mistaken. In the interval, the Earl of Cranmore remained in Harrogate. This was unusual. He had business, presumably, in other places. He was a man of a large estate in the north and a house in London, and the kind of complicated responsibilities that attached themselves to men who had inherited young. He remained. He called on Agnes once, formally, in the company of Mr. Sayers, and spoke to Cecily for perhaps 20 minutes in the front parlor, while Agnes sat with her embroidery and pretended not to listen. He gave her a question about the household at Ravenswood, asking which servants had been present when the brooch was first declared missing. She answered it precisely. He made notes. He did not stay longer than propriety permitted. The second time he called without Mr. Sayers in the early afternoon, and asked if she would walk with him in the gardens near the baths. Agnes said yes before Cecily could consider it. They walked at the appropriate distance, and a footman from the guest house followed at the appropriate remove, and the Earl spoke very little for the first 10 minutes. which was not uncomfortable because Cecily had learned by then that his silences were not absences, but attentiveness. "You studied music," he said at last. Not a question. "My father was a clergyman. He had a piano, and he taught me himself. And when I was 14, he engaged a master from York who came twice a year." "You teach it now?" "2 mornings a week," she said. "The Briggs daughters, Harriet and Clara. They are not without ability, though Clara would prefer to be in the garden." He made a sound, very nearly the sound of a man who finds something almost amusing. She did not look at him. "My ward plays," he said. "My late brother's daughter. She is 9 years old, and she has not touched the instrument since my brother died in the spring." She waited. "She has refused 3 teachers," he said. She did not say anything to that. She had heard him. They walked on. The mineral springs sent up their particular faint, sulphurous warmth, and the late autumn light came through the bare birches at the garden's edge. And she thought about a 9-year-old girl who had stopped playing. "What was your brother's name?" she said. "Edward." The word was level, careful. The word of a man who had said it many times in the past months in circumstances that required it to be said without breaking. "He fell from his horse in April. He was 31. She said, "I am sorry." He nodded once. He did not say anything else about it, and she did not press, because she understood that the miniature turned face down on the writing table was Edward's portrait, and that understanding this was enough. The inquiry convened in Felthorpe in the 3rd week of November, before the magistrate who had originally declined to pursue the matter. Cecily had been inside that room before, 6 months ago, standing while the steward read the household account, and she was given 5 minutes to speak, and given no patience while she spoke. She entered it now with Mr. Sayers at her left and the Earl of Cranmore slightly behind him, and she was aware, as they took their places, of how differently a room receives a woman who arrives with a man of considerable rank than it receives a woman who arrives alone. She would not let herself feel gratitude for this. She felt it anyway. Mrs. Pollard's statement was read aloud. The dealer's statement was read aloud. The silversmith's letter was entered as evidence, and this time the magistrate read it in full, slowly, with the particular attention of a man who understood he had failed to read it before, and was correcting that failure now. Lady Ravenswood was not present. Her sister, Mrs. Gerald, was also not present, having left for the continent in October. This absence was noted in the record. The magistrate, a man named Hargreaves, was not without decency. He had made a mistake, and he knew he had made a mistake. And he corrected it in the precise and procedural language of men who cannot bring themselves to say the word wrongly. The finding was revised. She was formally exonerated. The record was to be amended. A copy of the amended record would be provided to her solicitor within the fortnight. She stood while this was read aloud, and she kept her face still. Not because she did not feel it, but because what she felt was too large for a room this size, and she had learned long ago that the moments that mattered most required the most careful holding. The Earl of Cranmore stood beside her as they waited for Mr. Sayers to collect the documents. He did not say anything. He was simply there, with the quality she had come to understand as the limit of what he could give in public. And it was enough. It was more than enough. On the steps outside the hall, in the cold, clear air of a November afternoon, Mr. Sayers spoke about the timeline for the amended record and the possible avenue for formal restitution and several other things Cecily heard at a distance. A small crowd had gathered, as small crowds gather in market towns when something official and interesting is concluded, and she was aware of faces she recognized from the assembly rooms in Harrogate, of Mrs. Prescott somewhere at the back, of Agnes standing with her hands clasped. Lady Ravenswood's nearest neighbor, a Mrs. Thornberry, who had been in the assembly room in Harrogate on the evening Cecily arrived, and who had not greeted her then, came forward now with both hands outstretched and said, "My dear Miss Markham, I never credited it for a moment." Cecily received this with the grace it deserved, and did not say what she might have said. The Earl stood slightly apart, speaking with Mr. Sayers. She watched him, the particular quality of his stillness, the restraint with which he held himself in the world. He looked up, and found her watching, and did not look away. She thought about the girl who would not touch the piano. She had been thinking about little else for 3 weeks. The afternoon of the following day, he called at Agnes's house alone. Agnes, with the discretion of a woman who has spent several weeks watching something happen that she does not wish to interrupt, found business in the kitchen almost immediately, and Cecily and the Earl sat in the small front parlor, with the door open and the fire lit, and the November light flat and silver through the window glass. He set a letter on the table between them. "From my solicitor in York," he said. "The position of my ward's companion, and the role of music teacher to the household, should you wish it." She looked at the letter. She looked at him. "It is a formal offer," he said. "From my solicitor. The terms are set out in full. The salary is here." He indicated a line in the letter, and she read the figure, and it was more than she had earned at Ravenswood House, by nearly a third. She read the terms. The household was at Alderton Park, near Skipton, a full day's journey north. She would have the use of a sitting room adjoining the schoolroom. She would take her meals with the household, unless there were guests, in which case she would take them in the schoolroom. She would be expected to accompany the ward, Miss Louisa Vane, in her lessons and her outdoor exercise, and to provide instruction in music, French, and the basic accomplishments suitable to a girl of 9 years. She set the letter down. "Why are you offering me this?" she said. He looked at her across the table. "Because Louisa requires someone patient and honest who will not be deterred by difficulty," he said. "Because I have watched you for 3 weeks manage a situation that would have defeated most people, and you did not once ask for sympathy. Because Mr. Fenn's letter has been folded and unfolded so many times, the paper is nearly transparent, and that tells me something about the kind of person you are." She was quiet for a moment. "You are describing a companion who will be of use to your household," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are not describing anything else." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. The light came in and moved across the table between them. "Miss Markham," he said. And it was the first time he had said her name directly, without the prefix of a question or the frame of a solicitor's formality. "Cecily." She heard her name in his voice. It landed as such things land, precisely and without warning. "I am offering the position," he said, "because it is a position I am able to offer without impropriety, and because I am a man who is careful about propriety when the person in question has just spent 6 months having her reputation shredded by the absence of it. I am offering it because I want you in my household. And this is the correct way to begin." The fire was very warm. The room was very quiet. She thought about the girl, 9 years old, who had not touched the piano since April. She thought about a man who had spent 3 weeks in Harrogate on her behalf and had not once asked her to be grateful for it. "I accept," she said. She arrived at Alderton Park on the 1st of December in a post-chaise that the Earl had sent for her, with a box of clothes that were somewhat better than those she had arrived in Harrogate, a situation owed in part to Agnes and in part to a small advance on her first month's wages that Mr. Sayers had pressed on her with the quiet efficiency of a man acting on instructions he had not been asked to explain. The park was exactly the kind of park that announced itself before you saw the house. Miles of pale winter grass and bare-armed oaks and stone walls running in the gray December light. The child who waited in the entrance hall was small and serious, and she stood very still when the housekeeper, Mrs. Fenwick, brought Cecily in. She was a small, serious child, with her uncle's quality of stillness, dark-haired, with eyes that were examining rather than welcoming. She was wearing a good wool dress, and her hair was braided neatly, and she was holding a drawing of a horse in one hand, with the absent grip of a child who had been carrying it for some time and forgotten about it. "You are Miss Marcham," Louisa said. "I am," said Cecily. "My uncle said you were coming." Louisa considered her. "He said you were sensible." "I try to be," Cecily said. "Mrs. Alton was sensible," Louisa said, referring to some previous teacher. "She smelled of lavender water, and she cried twice." "I do not cry when I am at work," Cecily said. "I save it for private moments." Louisa looked at her with the particular attention of a child who is deciding whether she has been teased, and having decided that she has, is not certain whether she minds. "My uncle also said you played the piano," she said. "I did once. I still know the notes." "There is a piano in the music room," Louisa said. "It has not been opened since April." "I know," Cecily said. "You do not have to play it," Louisa said, with the particular fierceness of a child who has been told too many times that it was all right if she did not feel ready. "No," Cecily said. "Neither do you. Not until you want to." Louisa looked at her for a long moment, and then looked down at the drawing of the horse. "Would you like to see the library?" she said. "It is the best room." "Very much," said Cecily. The Earl of Cranmore was in residence at Alderton Park only part of the time. He came and went on the business of his estate, and his parliamentary duties, and the various obligations that attach to a man of his position, and he was in the house perhaps 2 weeks in 4. When he was there, he was correct and distant in the manner the household required. He spoke to Cecily in the presence of Mrs. Fenwick about Louisa's progress. He spoke to her at dinner, when she was invited to the dining room, about Louisa's current enthusiasm for natural history and whether she thought the Skipton Lending Library held adequate volumes on the subject. He did not speak to her about anything that was not Louisa. She noticed the miniature was not turned face down on his desk here at Alderton Park. It sat in its worn leather case on the mantelpiece of his study, open, Edward Vane's face visible to anyone who entered the room. In the second week of December, the night a frost came down hard enough to silver every stone in the garden, she passed the music room in the early evening and heard a sound from inside it. She stopped. She listened. It was a single note, played once. Slowly, the way a hand finds a key in the dark, making certain of it. She did not open the door. She stood in the corridor and listened to Louisa find the note, and then find the next one, and then stop, and then begin again from the beginning with both hands. She stood there until it was properly cold, and then she went quietly to her sitting room. In the morning, Louisa said nothing about the piano, and Cecily said nothing about it, and they went on with the morning's French as they always did. And the only difference was a quality in the room, a small brightness in the air between them, like the first sign of a thaw. The evening of the Skipton Assembly, 3 days before Christmas, was the first occasion on which Cecily appeared in public as a member of the Alderton Park household. She had not wished to attend. The Earl had said, simply, that Louisa had expressed a desire to watch the dancing from the upper gallery, and that Mrs. Fenwick would accompany her, and that her attendance was not required. She had said she would go, because Louisa had asked her, quietly, the night before, if she would come. She wore the gray gown again, remade at the waist by the Alderton Park seamstress into something that sat better, and she stood near the gallery railing with Louisa and Mrs. Fenwick and watched the floor below fill with the first families of the county. She did not know many people here. She was grateful for this. The Earl arrived late, which was his habit. He came directly to the gallery, as if he had known to look for her there, and he greeted Louisa and Mrs. Fenwick, and then looked at Cecily. "You came," he said. "Louisa asked me," she said. "I know," he said. "I am glad." She looked at him for a moment, this careful man in a dark coat who had come to her in an assembly room in Harrogate with his solicitor and a set of house accounts and remade the past 6 months of her life by taking them seriously. She was aware of Louisa pressing close to the railing with great interest in the dancing below, and of Mrs. Fenwick doing the thing that Mrs. Fenwick did well, which was to be suddenly absorbed in something in the opposite direction. "Your ward is beginning to play again," she said. He looked at Louisa. Something moved through his face, very quickly, something that was not composure, and did not pretend to be. "I know," he said. "I heard her 2 nights ago." "She did not want you to know," Cecily said. "I know that also," he said. He looked back at her, and the quality of his attention was the same as it had been in the anteroom in Harrogate and in the small parlor of Agnes's house, the quality of a man who is looking at what is actually there rather than what he has already decided to find. "She plays because you are here," he said. "She told me, 2 weeks ago, that you were the first person who had not told her it was all right if she was not ready." Cecily was quiet. "I am not able to give her that," he said. "I am too much inside the loss." Below them, the orchestra began a country dance, and the floor filled with couples in the bright particular pattern of a Regency assembly, the candles catching the white of the women's gowns and the dark of the men's coats, and the sound rose up warm and familiar into the gallery where they stood. She was aware of exactly where he was in the narrow space beside her. She was aware of the line of his shoulder, the steadiness of his hands on the railing, the quality of his breathing, which had altered slightly in a way she had not heard before. "Miss Marcham," he said. And then, as he had said it once before, with the same deliberateness, "Cecily." She looked at him. "I find myself," he said, "in the position of a man who has arranged a correct and proper situation, and now cannot pretend that correctness and propriety are all that is at issue." She said nothing. She waited, because she had learned that he required the space to finish what he had begun. "I have been in rooms with you for 6 weeks, he said. "In the anteroom in Harrogate, and in the magistrate's hall, and in Agnes Barton's front parlor, and in every room in this house where the business of this household has required it. I have watched you with Louisa. I have watched you with the serving staff, who have decided you are someone to be trusted with the small, honest things they will not say to me. I have watched you read Mr. Fenn's letter in a room where every piece of your position had been stripped away, and sit with your back straight and your hands steady, and I have not been able to stop watching you since." The orchestra played on below them. Louisa was absorbed in counting the dancers. Mrs. Fenwick had discovered something very interesting in the far corner of the gallery. "I am telling you this," he said, "because you are the most perceptive person I have met in several years, and pretending otherwise would be an insult to that." She felt the warmth of it somewhere precise in her chest. She also felt the weight of what was actually being said, the distance between his position and hers, the complications that waited on the other side of any acknowledgement. "You are my employer," she said. "Yes," he said, "that is not a small thing to ask me to set aside." "No," he said, "it is not." He looked at her with the same quality he had looked at her in every room. the looking that was not presumption but attention, that was not demand, but the honest statement of what was there. "I am not asking you to set it aside," he said. "I am asking you to know what I feel, and to consider whether you wish to know it, and to tell me plainly if you do not." She was quiet for a long moment. Below them the dance turned and turned in the candlelight. "I do not have the luxury," she said carefully, "of engaging my heart without knowing the ground beneath my feet." "Tell me what you need to know," he said, and there was no impatience in it. "I need to know that if I tell you I cannot receive this, it will not change what I am here to do, which is to be present for Louisa." He said without hesitation, "It will not." She looked at him. She believed him, which was the particular thing about him she had not been prepared for. The way everything he said turned out to have been accurate. "Then I will tell you," she said, "that the 6 weeks I have spent in this house have been the first 6 weeks in a very long time in which I have not felt entirely alone in what I carry." He was very still. "That is not a declaration," she said. "It is the truth. I am not in the habit of offering more than the truth at any given moment." "I know," he said. "I would not ask you to." They stood for a moment longer in the gallery with the music below them, and Louisa at the railing and the cold December air at their backs from a window someone had opened, and then the Earl of Cranmore, very slowly, moved his hand along the railing until the edge of his glove rested against the edge of hers. Not a clasp, not a gesture that could be seen from below, just the fact of his hand beside hers. Present, certain, without condition. She did not move her hand away. The season turned. Louisa played the piano every morning, at first alone, and then, in early January, with Cecily sitting beside her on the bench, teaching her the scales she had not yet been taught, because every teacher before had started with something more impressive and less necessary. The music room was opened. The windows were opened on warmer days. Louisa discovered that she liked Bach considerably more than she had expected, and considerably less than she liked the natural history lectures Mr. Sayers arranged for her in Skipton. But that was its own thing to attend to in time. The amended record from the Felthorpe magistracy arrived in January, and Mr. Sayers sent a copy to every establishment and family that had received the original inquiry record, which was a long list and an expensive undertaking, and one the Earl of Cranmore did not mention to Cecily until it was done. She found out from Agnes, who wrote to say that Mrs. Prescott had been heard at the Harrogate rooms, remarking that she had never believed a word of it. Cecily read the letter from Agnes and set it on the schoolroom table and looked out the window at the January fields, pale and vast under a sky the color of old pewter, and she permitted herself, very quietly and very privately, to feel the full weight of what had been restored. The Earl found her there an hour later, still at the window, and he did not say anything, and she did not explain. He sat in the other chair at the schoolroom table and opened the book Louisa had left face down on the page she had marked, a volume on English songbirds, and he read it with the quality of a man who is entirely content to be in a room and ask nothing more of it. He said, after a while, "Hargreaves has written to apologize." "I know," she said. "Mr. Sayers forwarded the letter." "Did you respond?" "I thanked him for the correction," she said. "That is the appropriate thing." He looked at her with the thing that was almost amusement. "You are terrifyingly correct," he said. "I was a clergyman's daughter," she said. "Correctness was the primary household product." He set down the book. He looked at her with the full quality of his attention, unhurried, sure of itself now in the way it had not been sure of itself in the gallery at Skipton. "There is something I would like to ask you," he said. She turned from the window to face him. "It is a proper question," he said. "The kind that requires an answer. I have spoken to Mr. Sayers about the forms and the appropriate communications. I have written to your cousin Agnes as your nearest relation, as I understand the custom." She was very still. "Cecily," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She heard it. She held it for a moment, the way she had held the magistrate's exoneration in that small hall in Felthorpe, too large for the room. She had known it was coming, or known that something like it was coming, in the way she had known things about him since the anteroom in Harrogate. She had not known it would feel, when it arrived, so entirely like the end of a long, careful walk home. "Yes," she said. He stood. He came across the schoolroom, past the table with the natural history book and Louisa's unfinished drawings and the corrected French exercises, and he stopped before her and took her hand in both of his. And the warmth of it went through her glove and settled in her palm and did not leave. He did not say anything more. He did not need to. The hand was the sentence, and she had learned to read his sentences. She looked at him. This man who had come to her with his family's ledger books, and his dead brother's miniature, and his ward who would not play the piano. And she thought that perhaps this was what all those careful months had been leading toward, not the restoration of her reputation, which was a thing she had done herself, letter by letter, and day by day. But this room, this man, this hand. He pressed her fingers once, gently, and then released her, because Louisa was expected back from her morning walk within the half-hour, and there were proprieties to observe. And they both observed them, and they were right to do so. The fire in the schoolroom grate burned low and warm. Beyond the window, the January field stretched pale and quiet to the horizon, and somewhere in the house below them, the piano had been left open from that morning's lesson, and the faintest ghost of a scale lingered in the air. The one Louisa had been working on for a week, the one she had finally gotten right. If you have stayed with Cecily this long, you know what that sound meant. Leave a note below, if you wish, and tell me what you thought of her courage. She did not declare her own worth. She proved it. The season turned further, toward spring, and the piano played every morning, and the amended record sat in Mr. Sayers's files and in the files of every household that had received the original, and the Earl of Cranmore's hands were steady when they held hers, and Louisa had decided that Bach was acceptable after all, especially the simpler pieces, and the miniature of Edward sat open on the mantelpiece in the study, and was spoken of by name, carefully, when the moment asked for it. The day they signed the marriage settlements, Cecily took Mr. Fenn's letter from her reticule, where it had lived for so long it had become a kind of companion, and she set it in the small writing desk in her sitting room beside the window, in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered. She did not need to carry it any longer. She had the truth of it in every room of this house, in the face of the child who played the piano, in the hand that knew the way to hers. She closed the drawer. The morning light came through the window and fell warm across the desk, and outside the January cold was beginning, very slowly, to consider becoming something else.